Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced on Friday that his government will temporarily suspend the airing of television advertisements featuring former U.S. President Ronald Reagan speaking against tariffs, following the conclusion of the World Series games this weekend. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. The decision, Ford explained, is an effort to help restart stalled trade negotiations between Canada and the United States after President Donald Trump abruptly cut them off over the controversial ad. The suspension marks a significant concession from the Ontario leader, whose campaign aimed to challenge Washington's protectionist stance and highlight the damaging effects of tariffs on workers and industries in both countries. Ford's announcement came one day after President Trump accused Ontario's government of misusing Reagan's words, prompting him to terminate talks. The Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute had publicly claimed that the ad distorted the late president's original 1987 radio address and used his remarks without authorization. Speaking from Toronto, Ford revealed that he had consulted with Prime Minister Mark Carney before deciding to pause the ad campaign. "Our intention was never to offend, but to spark a meaningful conversation about what kind of economy North America wants to build and how tariffs impact everyday workers and businesses," Ford said. He emphasized that the message had already succeeded in reaching influential audiences across the United States. "We've achieved our goal," Ford declared. "Our message has been heard loud and clear at the highest levels in the U.S. government and business community. Now it's time to create space for productive talks to resume." The premier confirmed that the advertisement will continue to air over the weekend, coinciding with the Toronto Blue Jays hosting of the Los Angeles Dodgers in the opening games of the World Series. "We'll run our message during the first two games," Ford said, noting that these broadcasts draw millions of American viewers. "After that, starting Monday, we'll take it off the air to give diplomacy a chance." The ad itself, which first appeared on Ford's official X, formerly Twitter, account on October 16, uses audio clips from Reagan's 1987 address in which the former president cautioned against the long-term consequences of tariffs. "When someone says, 'Let's impose tariffs on foreign imports,' it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs," Reagan's voice says in the clip. "And sometimes, for a short while, it works. But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer." Ford, who has repeatedly described himself as a big Ronald Reagan fan, defended the use of the clip, arguing that it underscored the timeless wisdom of free trade principles. He pointed out that Reagan's warning against tariffs is more relevant than ever in today's volatile global economy. "We share the same values President Reagan stood for: open markets, cooperation, and prosperity for working families," Ford said. Earlier this month, Ford had announced that Ontario would spend $75 million on an extensive ad campaign to promote trade and economic cooperation with the United States. He had vowed to target Republican-leaning districts nationwide, saying, "We're going to repeat that message to every Republican district there is, right across the entire country." The controversy surrounding the Reagan ad, however, quickly drew attention from Washington, with U.S. officials accusing Ontario of political interference in American economic debates. Trump's decision to suspend trade talks was seen as a sharp rebuke to Ford's aggressive media strategy. Still, Ford expressed optimism that his decision to pause the campaign could help reset the tone. "We've made our point," he said. "Now, let's get back to the table and do what's best for workers on both sides of the border." As the World Series continues to captivate North American audiences, Ford's temporary truce with Washington marks a rare moment of restraint in an otherwise tense chapter of cross-border relations. Whether the pause will be enough to bring President Trump back to the negotiating table remains uncertain, but for now, the Ontario Premier appears ready to trade hardball politics for a renewed push toward dialogue and cooperation. The crisp autumn air over Toronto carried a sense of tension and uncertainty as Ontario Premier Doug Ford stood before the cameras on a Friday morning that had already drawn the attention of both Canadian and American political circles. It had been a whirlwind of days, and Ford knew that his words now would have consequences stretching far beyond the borders of Ontario. The provincial leader, who had made a name for himself with his bold and often controversial decisions, was suddenly at the center of a diplomatic storm that had pulled in the highest offices of two nations. His decision to air a political advertisement across American television networks featuring none other than former U.S. President Ronald Reagan's voice speaking against tariffs had ignited outrage in Washington, pushing President Donald Trump to abruptly terminate all ongoing trade discussions with Canada. The move shocked both nations and sent ripples through the fragile web of economic relations that bound them. Ford's announcement that morning, however, signaled a shift in tone. He revealed that Ontario would pause its controversial television campaign after the weekend's World Series games in order to give trade diplomacy another chance. The ad, which had been strategically placed in primetime U.S. television slots, had been part of Ford's $75 million initiative aimed at shaping the American conversation on trade and tariffs. It was intended to remind American audiences that protectionism, though appealing in rhetoric, could backfire disastrously for workers and businesses alike. Yet what began as a calculated political maneuver to assert Ontario's economic influence had escalated into an international standoff. Ford explained that the decision to pause the campaign had not come lightly. He had personally spoken with Prime Minister Mark Carney the night before, discussing the consequences of the escalating rift with Washington. The Premier's voice carried a mix of firmness and exhaustion as he addressed reporters. "Our intention was never to offend," he said, "but to encourage a real discussion about the kind of economy we want to build together across North America." The ad, he insisted, was meant to provoke thought, not anger. It was a reminder of the economic wisdom once voiced by one of America's most revered presidents. In the advertisement, Reagan's distinct and authoritative voice declared, "When someone says, 'Let's impose tariffs on foreign imports,' it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer." For Ford, who had long admired Ronald Reagan as a symbol of free market conservatism, those words captured a truth he believed still held weight in today's uncertain economic climate. He saw tariffs as dangerous barriers that undermined cross-border cooperation, increased consumer costs, and destabilized industries that depended on steady trade flows. But for President Trump, who had built much of his political brand around defending American industries from what he called unfair trade practices, the ad was more than just an economic statement, it was a political provocation. The White House quickly condemned it, accusing Ontario of meddling in U.S. affairs and distorting Reagan's message for partisan purposes. By Thursday evening, Trump had publicly declared that trade talks with Canada were terminated indefinitely, citing the ad as disrespectful and dishonest. Behind the scenes, Ford's team scrambled to contain the fallout. Calls between Ottawa and Washington multiplied, with Prime Minister Carney seeking to cool tensions and reassure American officials that the ad campaign did not represent the federal government's position. In Toronto, Ford's communications team defended their decision, pointing out that the ad used Reagan's actual words and that no misrepresentation had been intended. However, the controversy deepened when the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute released a statement accusing the Ontario government of editing Reagan's speech without authorization and taking it out of context. The Institute asserted that Reagan's 1987 remarks were specific to a moment in time, not a blanket condemnation of all tariff policies. As public pressure mounted, Ford had to weigh political pride against practical diplomacy. He knew his message had succeeded in drawing American attention, perhaps more than he had anticipated, but it was clear that continuing to air the ad could worsen the rift with Washington. "We've achieved our goal," he said with a faint trace of triumph, emphasizing that the message had already reached the highest levels of American political discourse. "We've been heard loud and clear," he continued. "Now it's time to take a step back so trade talks can move forward." He confirmed that the ads would continue running through the weekend, coinciding with the first two games of the World Series. The timing was deliberate and symbolic. The Toronto Blue Jays were set to face off against the Los Angeles Dodgers, and millions of Americans would be tuned in. For Ford, it was the perfect stage for one last showing of the message he wanted etched into the minds of American viewers before he pulled the plug. After Monday, the screens would go dark, at least for now. The Premier framed it not as a retreat, but as a pause for diplomacy. "We'll give space for cooler heads to prevail," he said, hinting that the campaign could resume in another form if relations stabilized. The Reagan ad itself had become something of a political phenomenon. It was originally posted on Ford's X account on October 16, quickly going viral among both supporters and critics. In the ad, Reagan's familiar, Warm voice echoed over a montage of factory floors, trucks at border crossings, and everyday workers, images designed to appeal to the shared struggles of North American laborers. To many Canadians, it was a bold move, even admirable.